At a certain point, development stops being a slogan and begins to look like a balance sheet. It ceases to be an image from a press conference and becomes instead a schedule of repayments, a calendar of installments, and a growing fiscal burden that does not disappear with a change of government. In Uganda, this moment arrived when the accumulation of Chinese-financed projects began to form an interconnected system in which every new investment expanded not only physical infrastructure, but also the state's long-term obligations. The first visible symbol of this new phase was the expansion and modernization of Entebbe International Airport. For decades, the airport had functioned as a modest gateway to the country. Now, it was supposed to become a regional hub. Official narratives spoke of increased capacity, improved security, and alignment with international aviation standards. In practice, however, the project represented a multi-year loan arrangement with China Exim Bank, which financed not only runways and terminal buildings, but also navigation systems, security infrastructure, and technical back-end operations. The contracts associated with the project were never fully disclosed. What surfaced instead were fragments and leaks that pointed to unusual clauses related to dispute jurisdiction, collateral mechanisms, and financial flow controls. It was at this moment that Uganda's public debate first began to include concerns about potential loss of control over critical infrastructure. Government officials insisted that the airport remained fully under national sovereignty, yet the very need to make such assurances revealed that the relationship with the lender had already moved beyond a purely technical transaction. The second pillar of China's growing footprint in Uganda's energy sector was the Karuma hydropower project, one of the largest power plants ever constructed in the country. Officially, it was presented as a solution to chronic energy shortages and a foundation for industrial expansion. Construction was carried out by Chinese engineering consortia, financing was largely sourced from Chinese credit facilities, and control systems and core technologies were supplied by companies from China. Karuma quickly became a symbol of developmental ambition, but also of systemic risk. Construction delays, rising costs, and technical complications transformed the project into a far more expensive undertaking than originally planned. Each delay translated into higher debt servicing costs, while each technical adjustment deepened reliance on foreign contractors and proprietary systems. Alongside Karuma, Uganda developed the Isimba hydropower plant, a smaller facility intended to complement the national energy grid. Isimba was promoted as a rapid infrastructure success story, since construction progressed relatively smoothly and the plant was commissioned in a shorter time frame. Yet even here, questions emerged about build quality, long-term maintenance expenses, and financial obligations embedded in the project structure. Together, these projects reshaped Uganda's energy architecture into a system technologically aligned with Chinese standards. This meant that future upgrades, expansions, and servicing operations were naturally directed back to the same suppliers. Over time, a closed technological ecosystem began to form, one that made diversification of partners increasingly difficult. The third domain that exposed the true scale of dependency was transportation infrastructure. The Kampala-Entebbe Expressway was only the beginning. Road network upgrades, planned railway corridors, and logistics hubs designed to link Uganda with regional ports followed soon after. Each project was financed through similar mechanisms, combining sovereign loans with foreign construction consortia executing the work. At this stage, the impact on Uganda's national budget became unavoidable. Debt servicing began to consume an ever larger share of public expenditures. Funds that might otherwise have supported education, healthcare, or social programs were increasingly redirected toward infrastructure repayments. This was the moment when development began to compete directly with basic social needs. Government officials framed this process as a temporary phase of economic transformation. Infrastructure, they argued, would generate long-term returns through higher growth, increased tax revenues, and stronger foreign investment inflows. The problem was not the logic of the argument, but its timing. Benefits were distributed across future years, while financial pressures were felt immediately. Urban populations began to experience rising costs of energy, transportation, and public services. In rural areas, citizens increasingly questioned why billions were being invested in megaprojects while local schools and clinics remained underfunded. The gap between development narratives and everyday lived experience gradually widened, generating slow but persistent social tension. For China, this phase marked a strategic turning point. Infrastructure began to perform its secondary function, political leverage. Loans were no longer merely financial instruments, but tools of influence. Each renegotiation of repayment terms created opportunities to discuss new projects, preferential contracts, and long-term strategic cooperation. Uganda found itself in a position where its ability to make independent economic decisions was increasingly constrained by existing obligations. Formal sovereignty remained intact, yet the practical room for maneuver continued to shrink. The deeper the integration of financing mechanisms and technological systems became, the more costly any change of direction appeared. When numbers began to dominate over slogans, Uganda's leadership entered a reality that could no longer be masked by additional press conferences. Repayment schedules that once seemed distant suddenly approached with alarming speed. Each installment served as a reminder that infrastructure had not been built for free, and that development carried a price that had to be paid regularly and without delay. At this point, international institutions became more visibly involved. The International Monetary Fund intensified discussions with Kampala on fiscal stability, budget reform, and debt management. Reports began to reference rising credit risk and the need for tighter public finance discipline. For Ugandan authorities, this created an uncomfortable dual pressure. On one side stood infrastructure creditors demanding repayment compliance. On the other stood global financial institutions monitoring macroeconomic stability. This dual pressure produced a new type of political trap. Negotiations with Beijing were scrutinized by Western financial actors, while talks with the IMF were observed by Chinese lenders. Uganda's economic policy became the subject of parallel negotiations unfolding across multiple geopolitical fronts. The most symbolic moment of this stage occurred when reports surfaced regarding contractual clauses tied to Entebbe International Airport. Allegations emerged that certain provisions limited Uganda's control over airport revenue streams and granted lenders strong leverage in financial disputes. Although government officials firmly rejected claims of potential asset seizure, the structure of the agreements themselves revealed how far the balance of negotiating power had shifted. Infrastructure ceased to be merely physical construction and became a strategic asset. Airports, power plants, and transport corridors were now perceived not only as development tools, but as potential instruments of influence. Each facility carried political weight because its operation was essential to national stability. During this period, China adjusted its communication tone. Partnership rhetoric gave way to stronger emphasis on contractual discipline and repayment schedules. Negotiations became more technical, more formal, and less flexible. For Kampala, this shift signaled that the era of easy financing had ended and that the relationship had entered a mature phase in which creditor interests were defended more assertively. At the same time, domestic pressure intensified. Austerity measures required to stabilize public finances began to affect daily life. Reduced public spending, rising living costs, and declining purchasing power hit lower-income populations hardest. Development rhetoric gradually lost its mobilizing power. Protests began appearing more frequently on the streets of Kampala. Initially focused on fuel and food prices, they gradually expanded to broader political demands. Citizens were not protesting China directly. They were protesting the sense that decisions shaping the country's future were being made beyond their influence. Local grievances merged with global economic forces, creating a volatile mix that simple political promises could not easily diffuse. International media increasingly used Uganda as a case study of emerging development models tied to Chinese financing. Reports, academic analyses, and financial briefings compared Kampala's experience with similar patterns across Africa and Asia. Uganda ceased to be an anonymous East African state and became a reference point in policy debates, university classrooms, and investment boardrooms. For Beijing, this represented a strategic test. On one hand, China sought to avoid reputational damage that could undermine its global infrastructure financing model. On the other, it was unwilling to compromise core financial protections. The response took the form of selective flexibility, partial renegotiations, extended repayment schedules, and adjusted timelines without surrendering key contractual safeguards. Uganda entered negotiations from a position that was both weak and complex. The country required continued investment to sustain development momentum, yet needed to limit new borrowing to avoid deepening the debt crisis. Every policy decision demanded a delicate balance between short-term stability and long-term sovereignty. It became clear that the cost of development was not a one-time payment, but an extended process unfolding over years. Infrastructure loans stopped functioning merely as growth accelerators and became permanent features of the political landscape. They formed the background against which elections, protests, and international negotiations now unfolded. At this point, the story entered its most dramatic phase, because the next chapter would reveal what happens when a state must decide whether to renegotiate the terms of cooperation or accept deeper dependency in exchange for stability. When debt discussions moved from closed government offices into public political speeches, it became evident that Uganda had entered a new stage in its relationship with foreign partners. This was no longer the era of building roads and power plants. It was the era of managing the consequences of those decisions. Early signals appeared in official language. Government statements increasingly emphasized fiscal caution, project prioritization, and expenditure optimization. This rhetorical shift reflected rising tension between development ambitions and the practical limits of state finances. Behind the scenes, technical negotiations with Chinese lenders began over restructuring portions of existing debt. Rather than a single comprehensive agreement, these talks unfolded as incremental adjustments involving repayment schedules, deadline extensions, and liquidity management strategies. For Uganda, each concession risked further constraining decision-making autonomy. China approached these negotiations with characteristic patience. Instead of public pressure campaigns, discussions were conducted quietly, balancing economic leverage with promises of future cooperation. In practice, every conversation about debt relief was linked to new project opportunities, contract preferences, and long-term regional presence. Uganda attempted to improve its negotiating position by strengthening ties with alternative partners. Engagement with Western institutions and regional development programs was intensified to demonstrate that the country was not locked into a single financing source. Talks emerged around grants, development assistance, and support mechanisms aimed at easing debt pressure. Yet this strategy faced clear limitations. Western financial institutions offered support, but attached conditions involving structural reforms, budget transparency, and public spending restraint. For Kampala, these requirements carried political risks, since reform programs often produce short-term social hardship. Uganda thus found itself trapped between two models. One offering rapid infrastructure investment with minimal political conditions, and another promising stability at the cost of difficult reforms. Internationally, Uganda's situation was increasingly framed as an example of a new dependency model, where states attempt to balance competing geopolitical blocs. Diplomats began describing East Africa as a contested influence zone in which each major infrastructure deal also represented a strategic alignment choice. Within this context, a new source of tension emerged. Sections of Uganda's political elite began publicly calling for greater transparency in infrastructure agreements. The move was cautious, but highly significant. For the first time, the established model of closed-door project negotiations was openly questioned. The response was immediate. Supporters of the existing policy warned against destabilizing relations with a key foreign partner. Critics emphasized the need to protect national interests. The public observed the dispute with growing attention, increasingly aware that infrastructure and debt decisions directly affected everyday life. Meanwhile, economic pressure continued to mount. Rising debt servicing costs forced repeated budget revisions. Government spending cuts, project delays, and revenue-raising efforts generated political consequences that affected public approval. China observed these developments with strategic distance. It avoided direct involvement in Uganda's domestic politics, yet its negotiating leverage remained strong due to its central role in infrastructure development. Any attempt to reduce dependency required time, capital, and alternatives that Uganda did not readily possess. As a result, the country entered a state of permanent balancing. It had to maintain cooperation with China, negotiate Western support, and manage rising domestic expectations simultaneously. This multi-vector policy demanded constant maneuvering between conflicting interests. Here, the full cost of debt-financed development becomes visible. It is not limited to financial repayment. It involves the erosion of strategic autonomy. Highly indebted states must account for creditor reactions when making major policy decisions. Every move becomes part of a larger geopolitical game in which the stakes include not only fiscal stability, but political independence. Uganda entered this phase without a clear exit strategy. It could not simply sever relations with China because infrastructure and energy systems were already deeply integrated into that cooperation model. It also could not fully rely on Western support, which carried heavy reform conditions. The country thus found itself suspended in strategic uncertainty, where each decision represented a compromise, and every compromise generated new tensions. At this moment, the narrative reaches its critical threshold because the next stage reveals how debt pressure began reshaping Uganda's internal political stability and how society reacted to the growing social costs of transformation. When national budgets tighten, consequences rarely remain abstract. They quickly materialize in everyday life: fuel prices, public transport costs, electricity bills, and food prices. In Uganda, this process was particularly painful because society entered the transformation period with high expectations, cultivated for years by promises of rapid development and economic renewal. Disappointment came first. Citizens began to realize that new highways and power plants did not automatically translate into higher wages or stable employment. Large infrastructure projects generated jobs mainly during construction phases, while permanent employment opportunities declined sharply afterward. Urban youth graduating from schools and universities increasingly encountered labor markets unable to absorb them. This younger generation became the first carrier of frustration. Social media platforms filled with comments, memes, and videos challenging official development narratives. Citizens compared political promises with everyday realities in which living costs rose faster than incomes. A new public debate space emerged, less controlled by state institutions and driven more by emotion and lived experience. Soon, frustration turned into open resistance. Protests that initially focused on fuel and food prices expanded into broader social demands. Streets in Kampala and other cities filled with slogans addressing inequality, corruption, and lack of transparency in public finance management. Demonstrations lacked centralized leadership or ideological unity. They represented collective exhaustion with a transformation process that placed disproportionate burdens on the most vulnerable groups. Authorities responded in ways characteristic of governments under economic and political pressure. On one hand, officials attempted to calm public sentiment through reform announcements and support programs. On the other, security apparatuses were strengthened to control public space and prevent protest escalation. This dual approach created an atmosphere of uncertainty. In this environment, questions emerged about the sustainability of the development model itself. Citizens did not reject infrastructure investment as such. They questioned how projects were financed and governed. A growing perception formed that transformation costs were unevenly distributed and that those who benefited least were paying the highest price. In rural regions, the situation appeared even more complex. Communities that did not directly benefit from infrastructure expansion felt excluded from the new development narrative. They saw images of modern highways and airports on television, while their own roads remained degraded and access to basic public services limited. This contrast deepened regional inequalities and reinforced marginalization. At the same time, a new urban middle class was emerging, benefiting partially from development effects while also experiencing rising economic pressure. Higher prices, job instability, and future uncertainty caused even initial supporters of investment policies to adopt increasingly skeptical attitudes. China's role began to be debated not only as a geopolitical issue, but as part of domestic social discourse. For some, it symbolized modernization and opportunity. For others, it represented debt accumulation and loss of control over economic decision-making. This polarization further complicated government strategy, which had to maintain political stability while conducting difficult international negotiations. China observed these internal dynamics with strategic restraint. Avoiding direct involvement in domestic disputes, it maintained institutional-level relations regardless of shifting social moods. This allowed projects to continue even as political tensions rose. Yet social pressure produced consequences that could no longer be ignored. Declining trust in state institutions, rising youth emigration, and growing pessimism about future prospects began undermining overall system stability. Infrastructure development, originally framed as the foundation of a new era, increasingly appeared disconnected from societal needs. At this point, it became clear that the cost of development was not only financial. It was social and psychological. It involved loss of perceived control over the future, erosion of trust in political elites, and the growing belief that high-level decisions were not necessarily serving ordinary citizens. Here, the episode reaches its critical climax, because what follows is no longer only a story about money and infrastructure, but about whether a state can preserve political stability under simultaneous domestic and international pressure.